back to episode 2 of Great Moments in Orchestral History. Last time we got to look at a piece that allowed us to talk about a lot of different things and how we can fit a piece of music into different periods in history, relate them to certain events and certain trends. So I'm pleased that today, with the Magic Flute, we can talk about the opposite. We can talk about how the orchestra, in my opinion, is just an instrument. Sure, it's a combination of instruments, but when you put them together, you get this ensemble, but it's still an instrument. It's an instrument for doing things musically. So it's up to composers and others to figure out what we can do with this instrument, and it's often more flexible than people might realize. So with the Magic Flute, it's a piece that we now sort of consider and see performed at opera houses, like an opera. But in its day, it was referred to and is still a Singspiel, which means a sung play. So it's a play that has singing in it. So that sounds a lot to me like just a musical, right? Like musicals that we have nowadays. And in the movie Amadeus, which, you know, a lot of it is probably fictional, but certainly does portray a lot of things that did happen to Mozart. We see people ridicule him for writing a Singspiel because he's a composer of serious music, you know, his requiems, his operas, symphonies, chamber music, you know, which would be music for a chamber. But with a Singspiel, he finally writes something that is kind of trendy and popular amongst a lot of commoners in the day. So the man that approached him about doing this composition, which he completed just a couple months before he passed, Emanuel Schikaneder, it was his troupe that was doing these Singspiel sung plays that were really popular. They often combined folk tales that would have been familiar to people with singing and different props that were sometimes silly, as the Magic Flute is, because they're trying to entertain. And Mozart ends up doing all of those things, but then also sort of elevating this genre to something that is, whether or not it's serious, is definitely full of beautiful music. And so thinking about the idea of the orchestra as an instrument, Mozart is kind of like breaking the mold of what people are writing for, or what serious composers are writing for. And it's in this regard that Mozart was really considered in his day like the first freelance composer, whereas other composers before him were typically employed in one position or did sort of one category of things musically speaking. Like you would have had composers like Bach, although he wrote in many different genres, was employed by the church, and a lot of his music was performed in churches for those occupations that he had. And Haydn, you know, a fellow classical composer, was somebody who was employed by one court for 30 years, so he had a very consistent type of music that he could write and have be performed and be compensated for it. Whereas Mozart is somebody who had to think outside the box and be creative to find work opportunities. In the movie Amadeus, it also sort of suggests that Mozart was unsuccessful in gaining permanent employment because maybe personally there are things about him that were difficult for people to want to put up with. So therefore, he's having to think outside the box and do different things, and arrives at doing a Singspiel. And it reminds me of, like, nowadays, you know, we have the same thing. We have composers who are writing music for concert halls, but the orchestra is an instrument, and it gets used in other circumstances. Like we talked about the Magic of Flute being essentially like a musical. Well, you know, orchestras are still to this day used in musicals, and this sort of comparison reminds me of the composer and also conductor Leonard Bernstein, who was kind of maybe not taken as seriously as he probably ought to have been for writing the musical West Side Story, despite the fact that he was, you know, also writing more serious music and conducting orchestras that didn't typically play musicals in a concert hall. So in that regard, Mozart's thinking out of the box, and just like Bernstein did, and even going beyond that, we see orchestras today, or we might not see them, but we hear them in like a majority of soundtracks for films. We can see them even be in reimagined in new contexts, like collaborating with Metallica on that album S&M, where it's just Metallica and the symphony playing together. You can see like a Kanye West album where they do live performance of all of his tracks with arrangements for orchestra. The Magic Flute to me signals that there aren't limitations on what you can do with the instrument of the orchestra, and that's the way Mozart approached it. And I think in that regard, it's sort of it's inspiring to us and to future composers that we can maybe sort of add to and expand what the orchestra is capable of doing, not only as an instrument, but then now also as an institution as well. So if you stay through to the end of the video, you'll have the unique opportunity to hear me sing a couple little excerpts from the Magic Flute. But before we do that, I'd like to just take a little closer look at the piece itself. I think that the Magic Flute, like any other opera, is definitely a product of its time and of its culture. To start with, the overture to the opera, so the overture being the introduction before the curtain is raised, we have this instrumental bit of music that is just the orchestra, that sort of is intended to get the audience settled so that they're ready for the story and the events to unfold after the overture. So it's in this overture that we can definitely recognize that the ideas of the Enlightenment were important to Mozart. Both he and Beethoven were members of the Freemasons, which was a relatively new organization at that time, and allowed people, like-minded individuals, or somewhat like-minded individuals, to get together and discuss how things could be done, with the idea that reason would influence a lot of decision-making in society and in politics and things like that. So in the story of the Magic Flute, there is a brotherhood, which certainly has a lot of similarities to the Freemasons. So we have this brotherhood, and they convene, and they are very wise. And Sarastro, one of the characters of the opera, who we find out later, well, we know earlier on that Sarastro is sort of the leader of this brotherhood of men. And so I think that at the beginning of the overture, this reminds me of the brotherhood, the nobility, not nobility of class or privilege, but noble decision-making. Partly doing this because it's the singing more so than the overture that can really demonstrate some of the silliness of this opera. So for example, in these excerpts that you're going to hear, the singers aren't really actually singing words. They're sort of singing nonsense just on a syllable. Right? So the first excerpt that you're going to hear is the Queen of the Night, who is sort of one of the antagonists in the story. Perhaps unfair to her, but that's the way she's written into the story. She's a mom, but she in this scene is demonstrated as being kind of losing it, kind of being insane. So this is legendarily high singing. So like there's this really famous video that inspired a movie. I'm forgetting the name of the movie now, but where there's a woman, an amateur musician who sings this and doesn't do so well with it because it's really difficult. It's really difficult. The singing is really, really high. So I'm going to move it down a little bit because I don't even pretend to be a singer. So she's just singing on the syllable ah, and with this sort of crazed look on her face. So here's a little bit of that. We have Prince Tamino's sidekick Papageno, the bird catcher, and he finally has found somebody that he can also be affectionate towards. And here in this scene, that they are courting each other. And just by coincidence, his name is Papageno, and her name, would you have it, is Papagena. So it's like they're just destined to be together. And with the playfulness of this opera, they don't even sing words. They just sing this one syllable. So it's just sort of nonsense. It's pretty silly. So over in this part of your screenshot, you're going to hear the singing of the character Papageno. Smooth guy. He's working it. Then over here, you're going to hear Papagena as she considers these overtures that are made by Papageno. So let's see how things work out. Pa 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 pa